Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to NEW302. Today is, Thursday, March the 25th. So I wanted to first say thank you to everybody for your outreach and your concerns. That was all very much appreciated. I wanted to assure everybody that I am okay. This is not remotely life-threatening. It is mostly, in fact, just highly inconvenient. Insofar as it makes staying in certain positions for long periods of time kind of uncomfortable. So I'm coming to you, as I did before, from the depth psych section and the ongoing aftercare. So I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for your well wishes, and I'm okay. The aftercare, as I mentioned, is kind of onerous, and it's sort of daily, and so that has necessarily slowed me down in a way that I don't care for. But I am endeavoring to get caught up with reasonable haste. So, so hopefully I should be able to address sort of the, sort of backlog relatively soon, and I do appreciate your patience. I'm kind of taking things as quickly as I can without obviously impacting my health yet further. So, today we are talking about the deconstruction of the image. And specifically in the terms that we're talking about it here, right? The deconstruction of the image, partly I want to reference this idea of the deconstruction of the image that goes on during the process of analysis and analytical psych. So this is the deconstruction of the image symbolically speaking, something that we have obviously done quite a bit of. But also I wanted to take it as an opportunity to engage the critique of deconstruction, the deconstructive critique, rather, of Jung's ideas, primarily through the lens of Wolfgang Giegerich. So we have talked about some of the sort of critiques and modifications and caveats that have been introduced by people who are in the depth psychological field post-Jung. And, broadly speaking, if you look at the book, sort of Jung and the post-Jungians, you'll find that these things, as they often do, have come in sort of broad waves. So there was this initial wave of people who followed Jung directly and often were his analyst hands to begin with, trained under him, and there's sort of each successive wave of analysts that comes in that tends to bring their own take, their own flavor, their own approach, their own interpretation. So foremost, among the ones that I think are interesting to consider in this context are, of course, James Hillman and Wolfgang Giegerich. And James Hillman and Wolfgang Giegerich are very much actually sort of opposed in their approach, where James Hillman's approach is to move more into the mythic, more into the sort of divided state of the psyche in some important sense, more into the image, right? James Hillman ends up calling his work sort of archetypal psychology, so he ends up, in fact, somewhat distancing himself from depth in his distinctions. And he has an idea, which is outlined somewhat in his book, Revisioning Psychology, but expanded considerably through his quite prolific work, right? That, we need to be taking the image, taking the dream, taking the process, taking these psychological events on their own terms. So Hillman says, I'm paraphrasing here, but Hillman says, everything that you need to interpret a dream is in the dream, right? It's a kind of complete thing. It's a totality. Everything that you need to interpret the dream is in the dream. Hillman also, of course, famously, moves away from Jung's conception of the self. Basically, he says that, this sort of concern with the self, at least the self as a preeminent centralizing force, really is a kind of unwillingness, right, to commit to the premise of this sort of like pantheon, right, the differentiation of the psyche, the fact that there are all these different forces. And Hillman says, there's this almost a fetishizing that goes on with the self. He's, in sideways terms, a bit critical of Edinger. because he says, there's this idea, it's like, oh yeah, ego and self and everything else is sort of extraneous. And what he says is, no, like these things need to be treated on their own terms, and we have to stop attempting to sort of force the recombination of everything, right? To boil it down to some unitive point, but instead to experience this differentiated reality, right? Rather than sort of cramming our minds into monotheism, this single power, one God thing. It's like, no, you should learn to reconcile yourself to polytheism, right? To the idea that there are many forces, many powers, many principalities. And that's an interesting idea, and I'm a big fan of Hillman. I'm a big fan of all these people, I have to add, even where I don't typically agree with them. And in Hillman's case, I think that he's correct on sort of one level, but misses the core sort of integrative aspects of why the self is important, why it's important to have some kind of overarching force. And I believe I've mentioned before, but often when I'm considering these issues, I sort of think of them in terms of like a sketch version of Hinduism, right? Where, yes, it's the case that there are many gods, right? There are many gods, and many Hinduisms properly. But there are many gods, but those gods are also sort of emanations of a central force that is above being and non-being, right? So the gods are incredibly powerful. They're absolutely sort of at the top of, whatever hierarchy you want to create in terms of sort of reality, in terms of their wisdom and their power and their impact and their longevity and all this business. But nevertheless, they are themselves emanations, right? They are themselves emanations, insofar as the whole universe is this kind of emanation, this exhalation of breath, by, the being that is above all of that, right? For whom this is a great dream, and it sort of breaks itself into pieces. Now, I'm an old fan of this idea, the idea that you find coded in the religious works as the concept of tattvamasi, thou art that, which is the idea that there is no essential difference between you and the thing that you are seeing, right? And we all accept that that is sort of the case in reality. Like, well, maybe we don't all accept it. I take it as given, for the most part, that we understand that reality is in some sense all one big thing. Like, it has sort of apparent parts, but everything is connected together. It's not like you can literally take something and remove it from reality. That doesn't mean anything, in a way. So this tattvamasi principle, this thou art that you are part of the universe, and that everything else in its apparent differences is likewise part of the universe, is the same kind of principle that one applies into the psyche under Hillman. To sort of unify these two ideas is what I'm getting at, right? Where Hillman says, look, you need to speak with the gods on their own terms, right? You need to take them seriously, not just treat them as being, like way stations on the road to the self. And to my way of thinking, it's like, well, yes and no. In the same way as Hinduism, it's like, sure, if you want something very specific done, right, as in any system of many gods, any pantheon, you approach the being for whom that particular thing is in their portfolio. So, right, if you are, looking for love, right, it's the love goddess, typically, that you want to talk to, right? If you're looking for health, you want to talk to whatever local analog of the health goddess. If you're about to write a test, right, or write an essay, you may want to appeal to the god of writing or the god of knowledge, which incidentally I used to do quite a bit when I was younger. I would write invocations to Tot and to Ganesh at the top of my papers, my exam papers, very often if I was writing an English exam. It just felt like good form. Anyway, so the point is, right, you want to engage the being whose portfolio, right, contains the aspect of reality that you're getting at. If your concern is fire, you want to pray to Agni, and so on and so forth. However, that doesn't mean that there isn't attention to be paid to the kind of hypercontext, right? To this overarching hypercontext, to a kind of implicit monotheism. And I think the the tension that exists there, that is slightly paradoxical, as far as I'm concerned, is quite good. This is a fundamental tension that you get already within any psychodynamic system. Because, of course, by all appearances, we are one being. Then we recognize, of course, that it's like, no, wait, we definitely have parts, right? We start looking and we realize there are parts, and those parts are in tension with each other. They're not always on the same page. It turns out we thought we were a one-person business, but actually there is a board of directors, and we haven't even met half the directors. They are sort of collectively deciding on the various functions, right, that the company of us is going to be going through. But then, at some higher level, right, it is the case that yes, but it is sort of one company, and that is continuous. So this is an answer typically that I tend to sort of hold in mind when I'm thinking of Hillman. And Hillman is quite strident, and I understand his attitude is a corrective one, because while Jung himself actually did put a lot of emphasis on the need to treat these things on their own terms, often the schematization that we see within sort of later depth psych has a tendency to sideline that stuff, right? And so it's endless mentions of ego, shadow, self, anima, animus, and you're good, right? Never mind all of the other functions and forces and archetypal things that are going on. There's a tendency to almost sort of reduce it to a kind of family structure, right? Here are the mother and the father. They've gone in and, okay, here's the parts of myself that I don't like, and here's what I want to be, and here's my mask, persona, and we're good, right? Whereas, in fact, there's a lot of other stuff going on there, and it demands to be treated on its own terms. So I do understand Hillman's point in the corrective. But he places, as Jung himself did, this enormous emphasis on the image. And this is one of the places where Giegerich basically starts to level his attack, his critique. Now, Giegerich, as I've previously mentioned, is a somewhat difficult figure. And when I say that, I mean that he can be hard to read. If you try to read Soul's Logical Life, he has, as I've mentioned, an entire passage about this, where he specifically references, the idea that alchemists basically wrote in an obscure way, partly as a barrier to the release of this material to people that were not prepared to deal with it, right? That if the alchemical secrets or the hermetic secrets were to fall in the hands of people that didn't know better, you would end up with sort of rampant sorcery. Not sure that's entirely wrong. I, in fact, am inclined to link that very closely with the entanglement that psychodynamic psychology in particular has had into the modern day, but through the 20th century, of course, with public relations, right, with advertising. And there is a very deep sense in which I'm a bit pained by this, despite the fact I used to work in that field, right? Full disclosure. I used to work in advertising and marketing. There is a feeling that we have sort of taken the medicine and made it a drug, right? Like we have taken the milk of the poppy, right? And rather than it being a thing that removes pain so that we can engage in some sense in the work of the therapy, right, and healing, instead we've turned it into something that can be added to put its hooks in people, right, to draw people in fact deeper into their complexes. A bit like the very widespread practice of lacing fentanyl into pretty much every drug you can imagine, which was not a thing I realized that they did. My ex, who's an OPP officer, told me about it. OPP detective. I guess she's a sergeant now. Told me about this practice. It's like, oh yeah, they're putting fentanyl in everything because it just adds a bit of kick. And I think, yeah, I used to find it pretty dastardly back in high school when you would find out periodically that somebody was soaking their marijuana that they were selling in a very dilute solution of cocaine so that it created a head buzz, and no other pot seemed to do it for people. And I remember finding out about a few of those instances and thinking, like, what a terrible thing to do, Anyway, but the point is that there is this sort of co-opting of the arts that is occurring there, right? Now, Giegerich, doesn't just stop at this critique of the image, and he doesn't just stop at this critique of sort of penetrability or accessibility. he extends that critique. If you've got time and you're into this sort of thing, I do recommend his book, The Soul's Logical Life. It's sort of his opening salvo in this respect. And, among other things, he gives a retelling of a particular Norse myth, which is sort of one of my favorites, about Thor making this venture into the land of the giants to kill a particular giant, and how it is a sort of illusory experience. And he unpacks this in the opening, along with a few other metaphors, to talk about sort of what his aim is. Nevertheless, he does write in a deliberately obscure kind of way. And his sort of criticisms about accessibility and the need for accessibility notwithstanding, I'm not entirely convinced that is entirely useful in some ways. And of course, he would turn that around and say that my conception of usefulness is itself an attempt to to split the unity of depth psych or something. So we'll get to that. So, okay, so first thing, right? I find the inaccessibility of Giegerich, to be questionable in its aims. However, Giegerich is a strong critic, and the field needs strong critics, right? There has been, because of the external pressures, right, post the breakup with Freud, right, there has been this ongoing myth of the war within psychodynamic or depth psychs, right? The Freudians are against the Jungians. This is less true than it's ever been. They're a dwindling population to some extent, and whatever rivalries they had tend to, in practice, in my experience, be set by the wayside. You don't tend to get the same kind of acrimony between these different groups as perhaps once you did. But nevertheless, a lot of analysts are older, and there really has been an embattled kind of mentality that's settled in with the Jungian set a lot of the time. There is, as I've mentioned previously, this desire to sort of canonize Jung, right, to sort of treat the collected works as, sort of received, divinely inspired material. This, I think, is starting to shake up a little bit as we begin to get access to, more varied and unpublished things like the Red Book, like the Red Book, or like Black Books, which I have here and I won't try to pick up because I'm likely to spring my back if I do. They're a good size. And there are other sort of texts and manuscripts and letters coming out. I mean, I've bought a ton of Jung books lately, so it's amazing what's kind of rolling. And that's begun to really complexify things, right? As things have come out of the vault, that has shaken the kind of orthodox original interpretation in a lot of ways, in a way that I think is good. But nevertheless, there's this desire to sort of canonize Jung, who was, after all, only human. There is also a kind of fortress mentality, right? Jung has been, to a great extent, persona non grata in the academy for a very long time. So, in that sense, right, this course and the other courses in this course suite, in interdisciplinary courses in Jungian theory, are, if not an anomaly, a relatively rare exception, right? You don't tend to get this kind of treatment at universities, and it's to the great generosity of the Woodmans and to sort of the ongoing beneficence of the university in this respect. It's hard to say no to money. That we owe this, that there's this space here where we can sort of treat this stuff academically. It is hard to do elsewhere. And never mind, right, all the lingering stuff about, Jung being a Nazi and Jung being a womanizer, and, there are some real flaws there, there are some imagined flaws there, but the point is, all of that has given the Jungian community this kind of fortress mentality. And I think that it has involuted it to a great extent. There is a kind of simultaneous, wall-building fortification thing that has occurred, but also there's been this sweetening of Jung, which I think is perhaps not entirely representative, actually, of the original material and the thrust of it. So, when one goes and looks, you buy a random popularization on Jung, you're going to end up with something that is, comparatively speaking, I think, quite sweet in its nature, right? Quite sunny. There are some exceptions. There's a very interesting 2-volume book that came out a couple of years ago called Catafalque. 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 I believe I spelled that correctly. And that book was, a fascinating break. It's not by an analyst proper, but it's very much concerned with Jung. And it, it was a breath of fresh air in a lot of ways, but doing something very different. I mean, its core contention is, nobody understands Jung. only this interpretation. Okay, fine. I suspect that that's probably not the case, but nevertheless, it was a really strong contrarian position and pulling a lot of the sweetness out, right? In many ways. It was like a book that sort of suggested it's like, look, everybody is treating this as sweetness and light and integration and let's all be friends. But really, actually, Jung is talking about this radical critique of the modern era and how the modern era, right, as a global culture in many ways, has turned its back on these ancestral forces, and they will not be denied. And it is going to come, right? It's going to kind of come back. There will be a return of the army of the dead, as it were. A striking kind of book. It's an interesting book. Again, if you're into this sort of thing, it's an expensive book. I considered actually putting sections of it on the syllabus this year. Decided against it because it's not properly speaking by an analyst, and it's pretty unusual. I might do it for next year, who knows. But anyway, so it removes that sweetness. Giegerich, likewise, pulls a lot of the sweetness. So he is opposed to the image as the primary frame of reference, right? He's like, this fixation on the image is idolatry, essentially speaking, in the sense of like Old Testament biblical idolatry, right? Thou shalt not make graven images, right? Or the continuation of that notion of idolatry as it occurs in Islam. You're not supposed to create depictions of the divine. And that there is this endless focus on the image as though the image is the reality, right? That it's the image that is the thing. And that the image is not just one manifestation among many. And I agree with him that Hillman, in particular, places an enormous amount of emphasis on image, and so does Jung. Now, I think some of that is due to the fact that image, specifically speaking, is a kind of accessible layer, not least because if you consider it's like, there's a few routes that we tend to look for the manifestation of these hidden traces within the unconscious. Dream, which primarily speaking tends to manifest itself in sort of image, striking image. But that's not all that there is there, right? Images are striking, but they're one language. They're one language. And perhaps no less important are these other sorts of language. And Giegerich, then takes this to a strong position and says, no, it's thought. It's thought that is the primary thing. Now, we don't have time, unfortunately, for me to get into the sort of deep layers of my critique of that. So I'll give you the foreshortened version. Okay, the foreshortened version goes like this. It's like, what's he talking about when he's talking about thought? Well, he has a highly specialized definition, in the same way as he has a highly specialized definition in a certain sense when he says psychology. This may throw you, right? If you are reading this paper, the second one of the two, right, on the neurosis of psychology and the third of the two, right? If you're looking at this, you're going to see him use the word psychology repeatedly. And psychology obviously can mean a bunch of different things. Psychology can, of course, refer to experimental psychology, like theoretical psychology, like they do over at Sid Smith. I'm nodding my head, but in fact I just nodded my head towards my workshop. That's not where Sid Smith is. Where is Sid Smith? It would be that way. Okay, so, there's psychology in that sort of academic, technical, experimental, theoretical sense, okay? There is, psychology in the sense of sort of your more conventional clinical psychology, right? Which is sort of adjacent to those other things, but has its own constructs. We think about the DSM, right? It has its own constructs, its own ideas, its own notions. And then you have the kind of psychology that he is talking about, which is this sort of depth psychology. And you don't have to go all that far into it to recognize that there are some differences, where these other forms of psychology have indeed borrowed some of the language of depth psychology. We've talked about sort of introversion, for instance, or complexes as turning up. There has been a broad move away from those things, even when the basic structures are in many ways replicated, in the way that I've talked about there being sort of a psychodynamic underpinning to something like CBT, for instance, or something like IFS, which is, again, as I said a little while ago, I think extremely Jungian. Sort of in its basics, although there are some real differences. And the more reading on it I do, I'm beginning to pick up those differences. But they're small differences. There's a clear family resemblance. Like, they're not even cousins, they're siblings. But when you start to get into this work, it's pretty obvious, okay, that there is a real differentiation between the two things. Like, to give you an idea, actually, and this is the benefit of being over on this side, okay. So, this book, this is a terrific book, right? Very handy. So this is the second edition of Psychoanalytic Diagnosis. Okay, second edition. Psychoanalytic Diagnosis, right, is a book that, you know, you would use to attempt to do the kinds of categorizations that you might use with the DSM, except it's not DSM categories, really, at all. So, you know, psychoanalytic character diagnosis, and talking about basically in terms of classical Freudian drive theory and ego psychology and object relations and self-psychology and so on and so forth, right? Developmental levels of personality organization, implications of developmental levels, primary defensive processes, secondary defensive processes, psychopathic or antisocial personalities, narcissistic personalities, schizoid personalities, paranoid personalities, depressive and manic personalities, masochistic self-defeating personalities, obsessive and compulsive personalities. I wish they would get rid of this term. Hysterical, histrionic personalities, dissociative psychologies, right? And so on and so forth. It is a kind of manual of, right, a diagnostic framework, and in places it is brilliantly detailed if you're doing this kind of work. So, for instance, many times I have referred to these two chapters on primary and secondary defensive processes, right? You know, extreme dissociation, sexualization, acting out, defensive enactment, somatization, splitting of the ego. If you're doing this kind of work, okay, you're going to pick this kind of stuff up all the time. And it's a different set of tools, in a certain sense, than the sorts of tools you're going to get with DSM thinking. They share some language. They definitely pass terms and concepts back and forth to some extent. But it's far more developed in the psychodynamic sense in a book like Psychoanalytic Diagnosis, okay? That's the kind of psychology that Giegerich is talking about with psychology. And so, you know, in a sense, he's already moved away, but he insists on holding the term. Imagine, if you will, that there was like 3 different things that physics meant, right? And I mean, there are a bunch of things physics means, but imagine if there were 3 different things that physics meant, right? And, you know, you sort of didn't delineate. And this is very much in Giegerich's style. He sort of, you know, is like, why should I have to stoop for everybody else to understand me? That's what it feels like to me. Okay, that's what it feels like. So you're interacting with my own complex here, but that's the kind of feeling I get. Nevertheless, Giegerich, when you're drilling into this stuff, has some good critiques. And this idea that he has that it's thought, the soul always thinks. My problem with that, essentially speaking, is it's like, everybody has their own thing that they think is the primary. It's a little bit like you see with other forms of psychology. You know, CBT thinks thoughts come first, right? Control the thoughts, control the mind. EFT believes that emotions come first, right? Those are incompatible hypotheses at some level. And I take it as given, and this is my background in cognitive science, that there is something which precedes all of these other manifestations. You know, if you're familiar with John Vervaeke's work or some of my work with him, you know, you'll be familiar with the concept of relevance realization, right? And the core notion of relevance realization is that there are certain kinds of intrinsic mechanisms of cognition which underlie the more familiar mechanisms we're used to thinking of, right? They're pre-semantic, pre-syntactic, pre-categorical, right? They're pre-subjective in some very important sense, right? My general thinking, of course, is that this is the level of primacy that one has to look at, that there is a fundamental sort of relevance and relatedness, right, that has to be addressed first. That is the lowest level. Now, you can approach it through all of these other levels, because it's a big swirling dynamic. So, of course, it flowers and images and thoughts, right, and music and action and so on and so forth. And indeed, right, sometimes when we're talking about dissociative symptomology, there's this acronym, BASK, BASK. And, right, BASK is the idea of sort of an integrated pattern of action, right? So behaviors, am I going to get this right? Behaviors, affect, knowledge is the K. What's the S? Oh, that's going to drive me crazy. Affect. That's terrible. I should know that. Behavior. I've not had a coffee. Behavior, affect. K is knowledge. My brain wants to say socialization, and that's not right. Oh, that's going to make me nuts. Okay, we're going to come back to that. If I don't grasp at it, it will come to me. Wu Wei, the path of effortless action. Okay, so I won't grasp at it. I'll come back to it. It'll come to me. The S. That's gonna bug me. Okay, so no, it's not somatization because that would be somatization. Is it somatic? Affect, behavior, affect, soma, body, knowledge. Maybe it is actually. Maybe it's somatization or soma. So behavior, affect. Anyway, whatever. This is not interesting for you, watching me wander around in the dusty corridors of my own mind. So, right, and you look for any one of those things, right? We'll say behavior, affect, somatization, or knowledge. If any one of those things is disconnected, you tend to see some kind of dissociation. That's often a sign of a complex involved, right? Well, similarly, I think that there, of course, is something underneath this, and it can manifest itself up in any number of phenomena which you can trace back. But the image, of course, is very striking in the way that music is very striking, right? Images in music are striking in a way that words often aren't. And so this notion he has that the soul always thinks, well, it sort of depends. If you read closely into his work, you'll find that his notion of what thinks means is a lot more complex than probably what you might be considering with just like, well, I know what the word thinks means. Again, this is part of my problem. It's like if you're going to use the word thinks, you have to maybe use it somewhat in accordance with the way that people would normally use it. You don't just get to sort of redefine things. And so this is one of the issues that I have. His notion of what thinks means, in the phrase, the soul always thinks, what he means by soul and what he means by thinks are probably quite a bit different than you might imagine right off the bat. However, he has some very strong critiques. And some of his critiques of the image and this primacy of the image, I think, are valid considerations. They're things that need to be sort of weighed, right, in the consideration of the work. So the two Giegerich readings that I gave you, right, the first one on the World Wide Web, I would encourage you to read both. The first one on the World Wide Web, is interesting, and again, he's taking a sort of a customarily controversial position because he's saying, basically that in some important sense, the externalization of the World Wide Web has rendered the notion of the unconscious obsolete. Now, I think that he's a provocateur. I think that this is intended to get a rise out of people. And it doesn't, admittedly, you're dealing with my complex here, but this does not so much get a rise out of me as it gets sort of a mild eye roll, right? It's not that it aggravates me, it's like, no, that's not true. Right? It's not true that the unconscious is obsolete. That's just not the case, right? To my way of thinking. The World Wide Web is a medium, like any other medium, and it does have some unique and interesting properties. We discussed a bunch of this in discussion, I think a couple of weeks ago. We talked about a bunch of this in discussion, and I said, well, look, there are certainly possible futures, I suppose, right, where our integration with this kind of distributed technology radically changes the nature of our being, right? So, it doesn't take that much to imagine. It's like, your phone is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Well, the second you can get that sucker implanted in your body, people are going to. The second that we can have it connected up directly with our nerves, people will. Elon Musk is already attempting to develop this, allegedly. The idea that we are, as per Haraway, right, going through the cyborging of ourselves. We were already cyborgs, clothes, glasses, like we already have integrated technology. But the idea is that once we have this kind of distributed, networked technology, we will integrate us. Now, for some of you, that's an exciting notion. For others, that is a horrific Black Mirror episode. And I think that is an important point. But the odds that if it is possible we will do it, I would say are quite high, right? If it is possible, we will do it, right? And probably sooner than we think in some ways. If that happens, it does raise some questions. And it raises questions of the form like, at what point do we cease to be human in the sense in which we would normally think of it? Like, there has to be some number of modifications, right, that after which we are sort of, we've, slid the bar far enough over that we are not human in the conventional sense. Like, not in the sense that Jung himself meant. And whether or not we retain a human spirit once we are all borged up or whatever, who knows? So, as an example, I think less about, virtual reality, which just strikes me as another form of entertainment. It's no different than a movie or a 3D movie or what have you, than I do about, augmented reality, right? And right now, augmented reality is crude. It's Pokemon Go, right? You hold your phone up or you hold up your Nintendo Switch and you get, a virtual environment imposed into the regular environment. But when that shrinks to the Google Glass, or when it shrinks to something in your eyes, or when it shrinks to something in your brain, well, then all of a sudden you're dealing with something very different, right? If it is the case that networked digital contents and modifications, right, when you can apply filters to your experience of reality and yourself, I don't know. Like, it's hard to say at where the level is. Does that just make us all like preeminent, digital shamans of the future? Who knows, right? It's hard. You can speculate about this, but it's tricky to do. Nevertheless, I don't take it as impossible that if that were to occur, then the nature of the unconscious would change quite radically, right? However, as it stands, right, Giegerich's take on the World Wide Web as being sort of having superseded in some way the unconscious, and the examination of the unconscious just strikes me as patently false. Now, it's true that the World Wide Web, and right by extension social media and all of these modern phenomena, are a never-ending gallery, a never-ending museum, okay, of the contents of people's unconscious. I mean, if you want to look at what's going on in the human mind, look no further than the internet. And I think everybody recognizes this. The human mind is this enormous museum full of cat videos and pornography and weird meme jokes and, right, convoluted conspiracy, but also just like moments of sheer delight and play and collectivity, right? And, there is the full richness and variety of human experience on display, and much of it is sort of unintentional. So, I don't, for instance, think it's impossible that the internet, in some sense, either does or will kind of have an unconscious of its own, right? And Facebook, certainly, right, is tapping into something very important, right? Facebook can predict things about people's behavior before they themselves know it, because they've got so much information coming off people, and they're running it through very sophisticated machine learning systems, statistical analyses, and so on and so forth. Like, at what point is it the case that actually Facebook's models have, some remarkably deep sense of you? But nevertheless, that doesn't exhaust the unconscious. It simply doesn't. There are aspects of the unconscious that are always going to be outside a mere technological experience. It's a medium. That's it. And it's a fancy medium. And it does a lot. And it's very engaging. And it encourages us to move in. But so did television, right? And television, likewise, had a lot of social effects. It was very fractitious, right? Television caused the death of the bowling league, as it were. Good book, Bowling Alone, right? Television really reshaped the societies that it landed in. Instead of talking to each other, everybody faced the same way. But that, in turn, was like a different version of the radio, where everybody would sit around and they wouldn't look at each other. They would sit and tilt their ear towards the device that was telling the story. And is that fundamentally different at the end of the day than sitting around the fire and listening to somebody tell a story? It doesn't seem fundamentally different. It seems like a medium. And one that has some upsides and it has some serious downsides. As you all know, I have strong critiques of the current formulations of social media. But nevertheless, the idea that it has rendered the unconscious obsolete just strikes me as utterly premature and provocative. I don't rule out that it may sort of prefigure that, right? That it might be the herald of such a thing, but it's not here yet. Okay. And in fact, all you need to do to discover that is to unplug from it. And if you unplug from it for 2 months and watch the richness of your reality when you are not connected to it, as indeed I periodically encourage clients or friends to do, and they all report the same thing. Everybody improves substantial improvement, but also this kind of like richness, right? You get energy back because your unconscious has been, pouring energy in that direction. But all of a sudden the energy comes back and, it turns out there's a magic theater and you already live in it. Okay, so that's the World Wide Web piece. Okay, so the second piece on the neurosis of psychology and the third of the two. This is, I think, a really interesting piece because, again, it's a deconstruction, but the deconstruction is around the practice of depth psychology itself, right? It's around the very thing that is happening between the analyst and the analyst and Giegerich's, I think, very clever point, and he references Jung quite heavily in this respect, is pointing out that there is this intrinsic paradoxical idea that is built into the work that is done within the Temenos, within the consulting room, that there is this fundamental friction, and that kind of incongruity fundamentally is a kind of neurosis. And he shorthands this. I'll unpack it a bit more in the second video, but he shorthands this. He says, the basics of it are, right, that, Jung himself advocated pretty radically for a kind of mutuality rather than an asymmetry in the therapeutic relationship, okay? So what does that mean? In the Freudian situation, right, there's one person sitting in a chair who cannot be seen and doesn't say much, and another person lying on a couch who cannot see that person and is talking. There's an asymmetry built in. And that asymmetry, right, where one person sort of has more power, more authority, more remove, has less at stake, right, has carried itself further. It's softened in modern therapy, but there's certainly a real impetus within therapy for therapists to be in their therapist voice, not engaged, not ruffled, right? We're encouraged to do this. We're encouraged to retain a kind of even balance because it's supposed to provide containment. And you know what? Sometimes it does. But like any of these techniques, it's only useful sometimes. It's contextual. In the same way as, right, like sometimes you want to have that kind of remove because that's what the client needs. They need that to get to a certain kind of place. But just because it gets them to a certain kind of place doesn't mean that it's always contextually appropriate. Right? Sometimes they need to feel like you are a bit more human. They need to feel like you have some skin in the game. I add this applies no less, for instance, to instructors, right? To professors who likewise maintain a kind of, persona thing that removes themselves from the human fray of the students. And you are the students and I am the professor. And to the extent that that gets reinforced, right, frankly, I think it causes more problems than it solves. Now, you have to have some barriers, right? This is why neither professors nor therapists are supposed to sleep with the people that they work with. There's too much power imbalance, right? It's so, right, there's something that's really tricky and fraught there. And that's true, right? That's true. Like, that isn't ethical, right? So there do have to be certain kinds of barriers, and if you are disclosing to your client all the time, the possibility that then they are going to start devoting energy to you becomes a real thing, and that's not what you want either. The space is about them. But nevertheless, there's this middle ground. You don't have to be ultra soft all the time. Likewise, there's a real movement in therapy these days to, the client is the expert. Well, no, that's not true. Not entirely. Because if the client was the expert, what the hell do they need you for? It's not true. At least it's not true in that sense. Are they the expert of their own experience? Yes. Do they have a lot of information? Yes. Is the impetus coming from them? Yes. Does the transformation and insight ultimately have to come from them? Yeah, kinda. Sometimes. But sometimes it's the case that what clients want is a relatively authoritative presence off the bat. They need to feel like they're with somebody who knows what they're doing because they feel lost. And that idea, right, in client-centered therapies can be completely sort of sidelined as the therapist is just like, well, we're just going to go where you want. It's like, yeah, but I need help because I don't know what I'm doing. is what people are like, right? For some people, you want to come in with that relatively strong kind of presence. You got to read the room, okay? So this is Giegerich's point. He brings out that Jung makes this point about mutuality rather than asymmetry, okay? And second, he points out that there is this very deep split where depth psych, right, purports to want to invite the shadow and invite the pieces in, but actually it's medicalizing the whole thing. Really, it sort of feigns this acceptance of the shadow, but actually it just wants to take all of the neuroses and take all the symptoms and cram them down so people can be a beautiful integrated whole and they can get out of therapy, right? It's false pretenses. So, okay, that's the first half. I'm going to upload that presently. I will record the second half this afternoon. I suppose everything is rushed and squeezed. So I hope you have patience, but I'll upload this one immediately. In the second half, I'm going to carry on this thing. I'm going to talk about this medical versus gratitude model. I'm going to talk about Giegerich and Jung's critique around this question of the neurosis and what Jung called the denial of the left hand, okay, and the sort of eschatological fantasy. So I'm going to talk about all of those things, right? These sort of intrinsic splits, the critiques that Giegerich makes. We'll unpack that, and time permitting, I realized I also need to do a thing on psychogeography, which I've been very much looking forward to doing, so I got to record that one too. Okay, so thank you everybody. Thank you for your patience. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry everything is all lagged up. I obviously didn't anticipate this. I'm trying not to feel too bad about it because I didn't do it on purpose. But nevertheless, I do appreciate your patience and I appreciate your well wishes. So good. I'll record the second part soon, and I hope, well, I'll see you there, I guess.